Hey everyone, welcome to the super exciting, long-awaited, and ultra-comprehensive Asexuality and Aromanticism video trilogy.
It's A-okay to identify with A. Identify with A. Identify with A.
This is part of a greater series on my channel called the ABCs of LGBT, insert clips here, or the ABCs of LGBT, if you will. Biological sex, gender expression, cisgender, between the hetero and homo ends of the orientation spectrum. Gender fluid, agender, neutois, and the mission of this massive 13-person collaboration, with every individual falling somewhere on the ace spectrum, is to break down just some of the fundamental and introductory terms and identities belonging to the ace community. Of course, most of these concepts are incredibly complex, nuanced, and subjective, so there is certainly a chance my guests or I make some mistakes while educating. If this is the case, I urge you to send an HD video of your feedback to collabwithashley@gmail.com, and I will do my best to spotlight some critiques and rectify mess-ups in a future video on this channel. That being said, on to the super clickable and super comprehensive ace and aro video terms master menu. In this first episode, we'll cover asexuality and aromanticism on a spectrum, explaining terms such as asexual, ace the umbrella term, aromantic or aro, Zedsexual romantic, Allosexual romantic, Demisexual romantic, gray asexual, gray A, grace, gray ace, ace or Aroflux, Quoisexual romantic, aka WTFsexual romantic, Akoisexual romantic, aka Lithsexual romantic, and Cupiosexual. In the second episode, we'll cover types of attraction, like sexual, romantic, platonic, sensual, aesthetic, and Alterous attraction. In that video, we'll also go over some sex attitudes, like sex or romance indifferent, averse, repulsed, and favorable, and we'll cover the difference between sex negative or antisexual people, asexual people, and celibate people, as well as the ideology of sex positivity. And in the third and final video of the Ace and Aro trilogy, we'll cover some Ace and Aro relationship terms like queer platonic relationships, or QPRs, Zucchini, squish, as well as some asexual slang like aces of hearts, spades, clubs, or diamonds, asexy, no romo, and additionally concepts like sex drive or libido, stone, paper, and paper mache, and some harder topics like what are some Ace and Aro misconceptions that permeate our society? What's the A in LGBTQIA+? Are Ace and Aro people really part of the queer community? What's ace and aro adversity like? What's amanonormativity, and what are people's experiences with it? And finally, we'll cover some examples of asexual community, culture, and Avon. Whoa, a lot of info, right? Now this trilogy is meant to be watched wholly and in order. It'll make the most sense that way. However, if you simply can't help yourself, every word on the screen is a clickable annotation which will take you to the time signature where that term is discussed. And if you're on mobile, there is a time signature table of contents in the description below. You're welcome. So without further ado, let's get started learning about the wonderful ace and aro community. So the first thing one should understand about asexuality and aromanticism is, like any orientation, it exists on a spectrum, with people on one end lacking sexual or romantic attraction and people on the other end experiencing sexual or romantic attractions. So let's take a more thorough look at this end and define asexuality.
Asexuality is a sexual orientation, and it generally describes a lack of sexual attraction and sometimes a lack of sexual desire. As such, an asexual person would be someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction toward others, regardless of their gender.
Got it, thanks Brian. Now I've heard people use the word ace as an umbrella term. What exactly does ace encompass?
Now, sexuality is a spectrum, and individuals who identify toward the asexual end of that spectrum would be ace. Ace used to just be a phonetical shortening of the word asexual, but it has since changed, become more of an umbrella term that encompasses everyone on the asexual spectrum. This includes asexual individuals, demisexual, graysexual, etc.
And as many of us know, people's sexual orientation can be different than their romantic orientation. So, Adam, what does it mean to be aromantic?
Aromantics, or aro for short, don't really experience romantic attraction. They can still easily have platonic love for people, it just won't be so lovey-dovey.
Great, now let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum. Allosexual and Zedsexual are both words to describe people who are not ace, people who do experience sexual attraction. Some people prefer to use the prefix allo, and some people prefer zed. Here's Brian from Asexual Outreach to delve more deeply into these terms and explain which of the two he utilizes.
There are a number of terms used to describe individuals who don't fall on the asexual spectrum. Allosexual is probably the most popular and common of these terms, but it has a few issues. Semantically and sexologically speaking, it doesn't actually contrast asexuality so much as it contrasts autosexuality, which is completely different from asexuality. The word allosexual actively upholds clinical sexology, finding its root in clinical sexology and often seeking legitimacy through the clinical sexological framework. Unfortunately, clinical sexology has a very destructive, very oppressive past, and so it's probably not something that we want to tie our terminology to. There are a number of alternatives to the word allosexual. One that stands out is Zedsexual, or Zsexual if you want to use an American pronunciation. This term was coined to describe asexuality and Zedsexuality as two ends of a spectrum from A to Z.
Interesting. Now, what about people who fall in the middle of the spectrum? Are there identity terms for them?
Demisexual or demi-romantic is when you don't feel sexual or romantic attraction until a close bond has been formed. So if you were demi-romantic, you might be sexually attracted to someone, but you aren't romantically attracted to them until you have an emotional bond together. However, for demisexual, you might have romantic attraction towards a person, but you won't have sexual attraction until you are both very close to each other.
Fun fact, I actually used to think I was demisexual, but I was accidentally conflating and mixing up my sexual and romantic attractions, as many people do, but it turns out I am demi-romantic. I've only ever felt romantic love for two people, and both times it took us establishing a deep emotional bond before that happened. Conversely, I don't have to know you at all to think you're cute, like in a I want to put my face on your face way, like in a sexy way. Any other words for people in the middle of the spectrum?
Gray asexuality, which is also known as gray sexuality, gray ace, gray A, and grace, is a sexuality that falls under the asexual umbrella. People who are gray sexual typically experience sexual attraction rarely or only under certain conditions, or they're just not sure whether or not they experience sexual attraction. Many gray ace people consider it an umbrella term itself that includes other sexualities such as demisexuality. I personally identify under the gray ace umbrella because I am demisexual. I have only been sexually attracted to 3 people. Some gray ace people choose to identify with a gender-specific orientation because they do experience occasional sexual attraction. For example, someone could identify with both gray sexual and bisexual. Sometimes in these situations, people will choose to create compound orientations, and they'll say they're bi-gray sexual or gray bisexual. The romantic counterpart to gray sexuality would be gray aromanticism, which falls on the aromantic spectrum. Someone who's gray romantic would likely experience romantic attraction rarely or only under certain circumstances, or they're just not sure if they experience romantic attraction or not.
And what about people who aren't fixed on the spectrum, who bop around between places?
Another sexuality that falls under the gray sexual umbrella is aceflux. There are 2 definitions most commonly associated with aceflux. The first is that an aceflux person has a fluctuating sexual orientation, but it always stays within the asexual spectrum. For example, sometimes they could be demisexual, sometimes they could be asexual, etc. The other main definition is that their orientation fluctuates between experiencing lots of sexual attraction, some, and none. Aroflux is the counterpart to aceflux, and it is on the gray romantic spectrum. An aroflux person would likely either fluctuate within the aromantic spectrum or fluctuate between experiencing lots of romantic attraction, some, and none.
And what if a person just isn't sure? They think they might be ace, but don't totally know.
Quoisexual or qua-romantic and WTFsexual or WTF romantic are identity words for when you can't tell the difference between attractions that you might be experiencing, or if you're just really confused about what attraction you are feeling. So if someone is quasexual, they may not be able to tell the difference between sexual and romantic attraction, or if someone like me is WTF romantic, they might not be able to tell the difference between romantic and platonic attraction. I've always been completely asexual, so confusion about sexual attraction really wasn't an issue for me, because I just didn't experience it. But romantic attraction was very confusing because I'm WTF romantic, and I really can't tell the difference between platonic and romantic attraction, except for like tiny little clues that I really have to search for, and it confused me for a really long time.
WTF or quasexual and WTF or qua-romantic can also have a much broader meaning, so I'm going to try and use an analogy to explain this to you, so bear with me. Imagine there's a questionnaire, and one of the questions on it is, are you religious? A person who isn't religious will probably answer no. A person who doesn't find that question relevant to them, or a person who doesn't understand what even constitutes as religious, or a person who can't answer that question with a simple yes or no because it's too complicated, or a person who just doesn't want to answer that question for whatever reason, might choose NA or not applicable to skip the question entirely. Responding to a question with no is not the same thing as responding with NA or not applicable. And when it comes to romantic and sexual identities, aromantic and asexual are often the equivalent of saying no to the question, do you experience romantic or sexual attraction? Whereas WTF or Qua is often the equivalent of saying NA or not applicable. Regardless of the topic or the question, there are numerous reasons why a person might choose not applicable or NA, especially when the topic is as complex as religion or the ways in which you experience attraction to someone. Not being able to differentiate between different types of attraction is one of many reasons why someone might identify as WTF or Qua romantic or sexual.
Cool, are there any other terms for orientations on this spectrum?
Akoisexual, aka Lithsexual, is experiencing sexual attraction without desiring the reciprocation of that attraction. Likewise, Akoiromantic or Lithromantic is experiencing romantic attraction without caring or wanting the reciprocation of that attraction. And in some cases, these attractions may actually fade if they are reciprocated. I've seen discussion from the ace and aro communities surrounding whether or not lith should be the prefix for this orientation. This is because the creators of the word lithsexual, and subsequently lithromantic, decided to use lith because it is the Greek root for the word stone. This is related to stone butch sexuality, where a stone is someone who likes providing sexual stimulation to another person, but does not want the sexual stimulation on themselves. Because more often than not, stone butch sexuality is related to the lesbian community, some people felt that this wasn't really an all-inclusive term, and thus the words akoiromantic and akoisexual came to be.
Thanks, Jeff. Adam, do you have another identifying word we should know about?
A Cupiosexual is someone that doesn't have a sexual attraction but still desires a sexual relationship. And a Cupioromantic is the same thing except switch the spectrum from sexual to romantic.
Awesome, that about wraps it up for episode 1. Stay tuned for more ace and aro terms next week, and be sure to check out all the cuties involved in this project. Their links are in the description, and a ton of them posted ace and aro content on their channels today. So if you want to have an ace and aro content party on YouTube, you should click them, find more. Okay, bye!
The stigma is they haven't met the one that's right for thee. But maybe there's another reason they don't wanna bump uglies. And just because your life is not a silly, sweet rom-com doesn't mean platonically you still can't find the one. So remember, sex is like a pizza pie. No toppings, please, just cheese is fine. Sex is like eating too much bread. It upsets the stomach, fills you up with dread. Even if you don't understand, listen up and join the marching band. It's A-okay to identify with A. Identify with A. Identify with A. Identify with A. There's so much more to comprehend. The spectrum just goes on. So don't feel bad if your term isn't in this song. Just know your label matters if it's how you feel. Don't ever let someone tell you your identity ain't real. So remember, sex is like learning guitar. If you don't got an interest, you won't go far. Sex is like Nicolas Cage. Some like his movies, some think he's insane. Even if you don't understand, listen up and join the marching band. It's A-okay. It's A-okay. to identify with A.